Hi, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody back for the third and final day of the 2012 Reischauer lectures delivered by Professor Donald Lopez from the University of Michigan under the title of When the Buddha Was an Idol. Over the last 2 days, we've been treated to an astonishing array of the movement of stories out of Asia, the movement of missionaries into Asia, and issues of misunderstanding and understanding and flows pretty much all across the globe. We've been in Italy, we've been in Sri Lanka, in India, in China, in Japan, and today we'll arrive in Tibet as well. Before mentioning his title for today, I'd like to introduce the respondent who will be speaking after Professor Lopez's lecture, and that is Professor Leonard van der Kijp, who is a professor in the South Asian Studies and East Asian Languages and Civilizations, who is a specialist of Tibetan history and literature and also Buddhist epistemology. He has worked actively in Tibet, also in China. I think I was remembering that for a while there we met more often in Beijing than we did around the Harvard campus. So it's great to have him serving as the respondent today. Today, Professor Lopez's lecture is entitled The White Lama Ippolito, an Italian Jesuit in Tibet. And this is, as we would say, the third turning of the wheel as the third lecture and also landing us in Tibet. So please, Professor Lopez.
Thank you very much. I see many familiar faces now on the third day, and I want to thank each of you for enduring 3 of these droning lectures. This is the final one. Conflict among religions is as old as religion itself, providing a central narrative in many sacred scriptures of the world's religions, even those as ancient as the Hebrew Bible and the Hindu Vedas. Much of human history is recounted in terms of religious conflict, from the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites, to the conquest of India by the Aryans, the persecution of the Christians by Rome, the Crusades launched to reclaim the Holy Land, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Turks at the gates of Vienna, the Mormons driven ever westward. The list goes on, extending to the present moment. It's only in the wake of all the bloodshed and destruction that historians have been able to determine that in almost every case, religion only provided a pretext, a rationalization, perhaps an irrationalization, for far less ethereal concerns than disagreements over the true nature of the deity. Any one of us can easily list the hyphenated pairs of adversarial adjectives: Jewish-Christian, Christian-Muslim, Jewish-Muslim, Hindu-Muslim. Yet Buddhism does not immediately conjure such conflict. When Buddhist is connected by a hyphen to Christian, the first word that comes to most of our minds is dialogue. Why Buddhism, despite its antiquity and geographical expanse, has somehow been deemed exempt from the perennial conflicts between religions is an important question, but is a question for another day. In my lectures this week, I've been looking back to the time before the Buddha was the Buddha, that long period lasting into the 19th century when the Buddha was an idol, an Oriental idol known by many names. The epigraph for these lectures comes from Marco Polo, stopping in Sri Lanka in 1292. Describing Adam's Peak, he wrote, quote, "And I tell you that they say that on this mountain is the sepulchre of Adam, our first parent. At least that is what the Saracens say, but the idolaters say that it is the sepulchre of Sagamoni Burkhan, before whose time there were no idols. They hold him to have been the best of men, a great saint in fact, according to their fashion, and the first in whose name idols were made." Although the Buddha remained an idol over a period of many centuries, knowledge about him proliferated as missionaries came to Asia and learned Chinese and Japanese. As we saw at the end of yesterday's lecture, the Jesuit missionary to Cochin China, Cristoforo Bori, argued in the early 17th century that not only had the religion that we today call Buddhism spread across Asia, but that the Buddha himself had spread it from his birthplace in Siam to China and then to Japan, where he had died. Other Jesuit scholars put the Buddha's origins further west. One of the most famous scholars of the 17th century was the great Jesuit savant Athanasius Kircher, described as the last man who knew everything. He wrote some 40 works on a remarkable range of topics, including biblical studies, geology, biology, and engineering. The most famous of these was his Oedipus Egypticus, published between 1652 and 1654, a 3-volume study of ancient Egypt, so named because Kircher believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that he had solved the riddle of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Kircher believed that Egypt was the source of human civilization. Adam and Eve, he argued, spoke Egyptian. Another of his famous works was China Illustrata, published in Latin in 1667. Father Kircher wrote it without leaving Rome, drawing on the, by that time, considerable corpus of reports and letters sent by his fellow Jesuits from India, China, and Japan. Father Kircher discerned a direct connection between Egypt and China. After the flood, Noah's son Ham went to Egypt and then to Persia, eventually establishing colonies in Bactria. From there, his progeny spread to China, as he called it, the last place on earth to be colonized. The Chinese were thus descendants of the Egyptians and derived their writing system from hieroglyphics. They also received their religion from Egypt many centuries later. Drawing on Herodotus, he notes that in 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Pelusium, then proceeding to Memphis, where he captured the pharaoh, killed the sacred cow, and slaughtered thousands of Egyptians and hundreds of Egyptian priests. It is said that the Persians advanced into battle carrying cats, knowing that the Egyptians would not shoot their arrows for fear of harming their sacred animal. Father Kircher explains that the Egyptian priests who survived this slaughter escaped by sea to India, where they discovered ancient monuments to Hermes, Bacchus, and Osiris, and revived the worship of these gods. From there, Egyptian religion, including the doctrine of the transmigration of souls, spread to Indochina, China, and Japan, bringing along, as he put it, its fanatic crowd of innumerable gods and goddesses. Indeed, for Father Kircher, quote, "There is no cult of the ancient Egyptians and their descendants which isn't followed today by our modern barbarians who have changed the worship of sun and moon, of Isis and Osiris, into that of Photo, that is the Buddha, and Chamis, that is Kami. All the old mysteries, rites, and superstitious ceremonies have been borrowed for the new pagan religions, just as if reflected in a mirror," end quote. This is specifically the case for Buddhism, which Father Kircher calls the sect of Siequa, or Omito, that is Amitabha. And he writes, quote, "When we investigate this sect, its doctrines show that it came from the naked philosophers of the Brahmins, Persians, and Bactrians, who formerly inhabited all Indostan. They believe in a multitude of worlds and in metempsychosis, which is the entrance of human souls into animals, and in all the Pythagorean teachings. They live apart on hills and in caves for the sake of meditation. Their temples are full of huge idols of bronze, marble, wood, and clay. You would think these are Egyptian shrines." For him, the figure responsible for spreading Egyptian superstition across Asia was the Buddha. Based on reports from the China mission and his own research into the religions of India, Father Kircher provided the following account of his life. The first creator and architect of the superstition was a very sinful Brahmin imbued with Pythagoreanism. He was not content just to spread the doctrine, but even added to it, so much so that there is scarcely anyone who's able to describe the doctrine or to write about it. He was an impostor known all over the East. The Indians call him Rama, the Chinese Seiqian, the Japanese Zaka, and the Turks Chiaga. This deadly monster was born in central India in the place which the Chinese call Tiantronyok. His birth was portentous. They say his mother had a dream and saw a white elephant come first from her mouth and then from her left side. So Zaka was born, and he was the first who is said to have killed his mother. Then he pointed one hand toward heaven and the other down to the earth and said that except for him there was none holy, not in heaven nor in earth. Then he betook himself to the mountain recesses, and there he instituted his abominable idolatry with Satan's help. Afterwards, he infected the whole Orient with his pestilent dogmas. The Chinese annals say that when he emerged from his solitary hermitage, a divine, or most likely satanic, spirit filled him. He gathered together about 80,000 disciples. He selected 500 of these, and then 100 from these. Finally, he selected 10 as being the best suited for teaching his horrible doctrines. He had chosen them as intimate counselors and associates in his crimes. Lest his doctrines be called in question by anyone, when dying, he decreed that the Pythagorean epithet be placed in his books. This phrase is, quote, he himself said, or, quote, so our books teach us. This means that it is evil to question the truth or the infallibility of these absurd fables, which are horrible and execrable. These are not tenets but crimes. They are not doctrines but abominations. They are not histories but fables. This is obviously not a flattering portrait. Father Kircher begins by saying that the Buddha believed in Pythagoreanism. For the church, this did not mean that he was a student of geometry, but that he believed in the transmigration of souls, or metempsychosis, a view that since antiquity had been attributed to Pythagoras, who is said to have heard the voice of a dead friend in the yelps of a puppy. For the church, the doctrine of reincarnation was a heresy. Father Kircher recognizes that the Buddha, a term that he does not use, is known by a number of names, mistakenly adding in the Hindu god Rama. According to later Hindu mythology, the Buddha was the 9th avatar or incarnation of the god Vishnu, with Rama being the 7th and Krishna the 8th. However, he correctly identifies India as the Buddha's place of birth, using the Vietnamese name for India, Tien Troc Ngoc. Calling the Buddha by the Japanese name Zaka, he correctly notes that prior to his birth, the Buddha's mother dreamed that a white elephant had entered her womb. And after he was born, he is said to have taken 7 steps, pointing to the sky, and announced that he was the best of bipeds. The Buddha's mother died 7 days after his birth, but nowhere does it say that he murdered her, as Father Kircher claims. He describes the Buddha as instituting the practice of idolatry with the help of Satan, and then spreading the practice all over Asia. It is his work, therefore, that the Christian missions must undo, made all the more difficult, apparently, by the fact that Buddhist texts begin with the phrase, so our books teach us, presumably an allusion to the phrase that begins Buddhist sutras, eva mayam shrutam, or thus did I hear. Kircher's view of the African origins of the Buddha would be repeated by Engelbert Kampfer, who was stationed in Japan in 1690 as a physician of the Dutch East India Company, and later by Sir William Jones himself. Indeed, as late as 1825, the illustrious French sinologist Jean-Pierre Abel Ramusat felt it necessary to publish an article entitled, quote, on some descriptive epithets of the Buddha, showing that Buddha did not belong to the black race, where he disputed the hypothesis that the Buddha was an African. But these various theories of the Buddha and his origins seem not to have been known to yet another Jesuit, Ippolito Desideri. He was born in the Tuscan town of Pistoia in 1684. He entered the order of the Jesuits in 1700, studying at the Collegio Romano in Rome. Following 2 years of instruction in theology, he requested permission to become a missionary. After audiences with Pope Clement XI and Cosimo III de' Medici, he made his way to Genoa, where he sailed for India on November 23, 1712. Braving high seas and Turkish pirates, the ship made port 5 months later in Goa, the Portuguese colony on the west coast of India. Assigned to the Tibet mission, Desideri and another priest, the Portuguese Manuel Freire, eventually set off on the trip north, first by ship up the Indian coast, then on foot and horseback through Jaipur, Delhi, Lahore, through the Himalayas to Kashmir, then to Leh, the capital of Ladakh, the westernmost Tibetan domain. They remained in Leh for 52 days. Desideri wished to found their mission there, but his fellow priest insisted that they continue eastward to Lhasa. They were able to survive the difficult 7-month journey thanks to the protection of a Mongol princess who allowed the 2 priests to join her caravan. They reached Lhasa on March 18th, 1716. After just a month in Lhasa, Desideri's companion decided to return to India, leaving Desideri alone, the only European and the only Christian in Tibet. Tibet was ruled at the time by a Mongol warlord, the Lhasa Khan, and Desideri was soon granted an audience. Apparently impressed by the Tuscan's determination to teach Tibetans the route to heaven and his declaration that he wished to remain in Tibet for the rest of his life, the Khan granted Desideri permission to stay, offering lodging and support. Desideri set to work studying the Tibetan language and the Tibetan religion. Less than a year later, on January 16, 1777, he presented the Khan with an exposition of Christianity written in Tibetan verse in a somewhat childish hand. It was not insubstantial, filling 128 short Tibetan pages. He clearly was convinced. He clearly saw this as the first of a series of works, calling it Torang Munsel Nime Sharwe Da, the dawn, sign of the sun that dispels the darkness. The Khan, himself a Buddhist, proposed a debate between Desideri and a learned Tibetan monk, but suggested that Desideri first undertake further study. He arranged for Desideri to live at Ramoche, one of the oldest Buddhist temples in Lhasa, and then at Sera, a monastery of some 5,500 monks on the outskirts of the city, one of the three seats of the Gelug sect. His notes from his studies, preserved today in the Jesuit archives in Rome, trace his course through a young monk's textbooks on Dura and through to the masterworks of the Gelug tradition. Desideri's studies were interrupted by war. A rival faction of Mongols invaded Lhasa in December 1717, assassinating his patron, the Lhasa Khan, and pillaging the city. Desideri fled to the east to the smaller monastery of Dakbo, selected in part because the surroundings had a few grapevines that he could use to make communion wine. There he continued his studies until the Capuchins, who had arrived in the fall of 1716, finally received an official letter from the Propaganda Fide ordering Desideri to leave Tibet and turn Tibet over to their order. He reluctantly did so, arriving in Kathmandu on January 20th, 1722. He would remain in India for 5 more years before departing for home. Ippolito Desideri returned to Rome on January 23, 1728, only to find himself and his fellow Jesuits on the losing side of the rights controversy. His situation was made more difficult by Capuchin charges that their failure to successfully evangelize Tibet was due to the errors of the Jesuits who had preceded them there. The last years of his life were consumed with composing long defenses of his work in Tibet, as well as the remarkable account of his time there called Relazione de Viaggi all'Inde e al Tibet. He died in Rome on April 13th, 1733. His works would remain unread and unknown for almost 200 years. In his Relazione, Desideri describes the religion of Tibet in Italian to his fellow Roman Catholics. Here he rarely mentions the Buddha, whom he refers to not as the Buddha but as Shakyatuba, the Tibetan version of Shakyamuni, the famous epithet of the Buddha, sage of the Shakya clan. Desideri identifies him usually as the lawgiver of the Tibetans, much as Moses gave the law to the children of Israel. Desideri seems to regard Shakyatuba only as the founder of the religion of the Tibetans. He does not identify him with the Zaka of the Japanese, the Pho of the Chinese, or the Samoda Kodom of the Siamese. In his relatively brief description of the life of the Buddha, Desideri is particularly interested in his nativity. In this passage, Desideri describes a famous moment in the life story of the Buddha. He had perfected himself over millions of lifetimes as a bodhisattva. In his penultimate lifetime, the lifetime before he achieved Buddhahood, he was reborn, as all Buddhas are, as a god, Hla in Tibetan, in a heaven called Tushita, or joyous. It is called Ganden in Tibetan. As the moment for his final birth approached, the future Buddha surveyed the world to decide where he should be reborn, in what caste, and to which parents. This is Desideri's description of that scene. Then, remembering our lowly world, he regarded each region most attentively and pondered how it had been reduced to a most deplorable condition of spiritual ruin by the blindness, the passions, and the wickedness of human beings beyond any help or redress. He then generated the highest compassion for them and decided to come to earth himself and be reborn as a human being to deliver humankind from evil and to lead them to eternal salvation. The Tibetan's lawgiver describes how he glanced down upon the world and resolved to leave Ganden and the supremely happy state of Allah to descend to earth and be reborn in the human condition. He employs a manner of speaking and a tone in making his decision and expresses such thoughts as he had on that occasion and subject that make it seem as if it were the devil himself speaking in the guise of a man or through the mouth of a man, and that he had undertaken to behave, as we say, like a monkey, by fully imitating everything our ascetics and contemplatives are wont and capable of expressing in order to make us comprehend the decree of the most holy Trinity for the salvation of mankind, which the divine word accepted in coming to earth and becoming a man in order to be our Savior at the cost of his degradation, his passion, and his holy death. After a long series of very tender and moving speeches, the Tibetan's lawgiver adds that once he had made his resolution, he glanced over the world another 5 times to determine the 5 special qualities of his advent: his caste or tribe, his country, his time, his family, and the woman from whom he would be born and take a human body. The special gifts and perfections he sought in the woman whom he had to choose as his mother are also like another copy made by the said infernal monkey of what our ascetics and contemplatives are wont to say about the divine word's election of the most holy Virgin to be elevated to the great dignity of the Mother of God incarnate. Another copy is his moving speech of how, before coming to be born into the world as a man and embarking on the great task of leading the world to the good and to salvation, he offered to endure insults, pains, hardships, and whatever might serve the goal that he had undertaken. In the story of the Buddha's descent into the world and the choice of his mother, Desideri sees affinities between the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, of how the Word became flesh, and the description of Mahamaya, the Buddha's future mother with all her virtues, reminds him of the Blessed Virgin, chosen to be the Mother of God. Desideri was not heartened by the similarity, but is appalled by it, seeing it as the aping of the infernal monkey, Satan himself. Here, without using the term, he evokes the Christian doctrine of demonic plagiarism, articulated by Justin Martyr and other church fathers during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, in which any similarity between ritual elements of the church and those of rival pagan cults is attributed to the work of the devil. Later scholarship has demonstrated that in many cases, these components of Christian ritual had in fact been derived, one might say copied, from the very same rival cults that the Christians condemned. The doctrine of demonic plagiarism allowed the church to claim, falsely, that the origin was theirs and that anything else was a copy, and a copy made by the devil himself. This doctrine was invoked often by Roman Catholic missionaries after the Counter-Reformation. There is, of course, another possible reason for the similarities between Buddhism and Christianity, a reason more human and less demonic. Desideri raises the question himself, the question of, quote, whether Christianity had at any time in the distant past ever been established in these parts, or if any of the apostles ever reached here. He acknowledges that there is evidence of an ancient Christian community in China. A Nestorian Christian stele erected in the Tang capital of Chang'an in 781 had been translated into French in 1628. And he mentions the mission of St. Thomas to Hindustan. Regarding the Tibetans, however, he writes that, quote, neither the history, recollections, nor traditions of the Tibetans give any indication that the Holy Faith or any apostle or evangelic preacher had ever been there at any time. Indeed, Desideri discerned a difference between what he called the other Asian paganisms, by which he likely meant the Hindu deities he had seen during his time in India, and what he called the special paganism of Tibet, in other words, Buddhism, although he never used the term. And he writes, "It is quite true that all offer up their prayers and incense to false and fictitious saints, but there is still a vast difference between them. The other Asian paganisms commonly recognize, preach about, and admire the unusual powers and extraordinary abilities of their objects of worship, yet at the same time, they represent them as impotent figures, as liars, or as intriguers, now frothing with rage and fury, now shameless and adulterous, much as the ancient Romans did Jove, Venus, Mars, Mercury, and Pluto. Such is not the case with the Tibetans. It is true that the powers and miracles that the Tibetans admire with such astonishment and wonder in their idols are but the bright colors and varnishes of fantastic invention. Yet these colors and varnishes are so pure and so good that they are capable of captivating and astonishing, if not the healthiest and clearest of eyes, at least eyes weakened that see things indistinctly. Nevertheless, while the Tibetans' indistinct sight may be dazzled, at least they are not nauseated to the pit of their stomachs by a rotten, putrid, and corrupt vision, together with the revolting filthiness of execrable wickedness and pernicious examples. This, therefore, is the difference between the paganism of the rest of Asia and the special paganism of Tibet. The former burn incense to revere and worship vice and unbridled passion, while the Tibetans worship a virtue that is certainly imaginary, but nonetheless purged of revolting vices and free from all unbridled passion. I do not deny that the other paganisms generally acknowledge some divine being, but it is one that is false, fictitious, unholy, monstrous, and execrable. It is true that the Tibetans do not worship any divine being, at least explicitly and directly, but they have chosen to exclude from all the objects they accept and to whom they burn incense anything they would deem worthy of disapproval and reproach than of honor and reverence." This is a remarkable statement, one that would not be read until the 20th century, because Desideri's work were placed on the Vatican's index of banned texts after the suppression of the Jesuits by Clement XIV in 1773. Desideri had spent a year in India before traveling north to Tibet, and he likely encountered images of various Hindu deities. And by the time of his arrival at the Jesuit headquarters in Goa, various European travelers had gathered many stories of the Hindu gods, especially from the Puranas, albeit in garbled versions, stories where anger, lust, and jealousy abound, not unlike the stories of the gods of Mount Olympus to which Desideri alludes. For Desideri, the idolaters of Tibet differ from the idolaters of India in two ways. First, the Tibetan idols represent virtuous figures with admirable qualities. He apparently had not seen or failed to mention the famous Yapyum deities depicted in sexual union, while the Hindu idols represent wicked and pernicious gods. The Tibetan images that he has in mind and whom he mentions by their Tibetan names are such important figures for Tibetan Buddhism as the Buddha himself, Shagyatuba, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, Manjushri, whom he calls Jamyang, the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, whom he calls Chenrizi, and the Indian tantric master Padmasambhava, whom Desideri calls Urgyen. Desideri's imagery is that of vision and its effect on digestion. The Tibetan idols are clearly false and superficial, form without substance, all bright colors and varnish, and yet they are also so pure and good as to be captivating, at least to those with weak eyesight. Those who see clearly would surely recognize their artifice. Still, the goodness of these idols is such that their ultimate falsity does not corrupt the Tibetans. It is visual, not visceral, not descending to the stomach, to nauseate the Tibetans with what he calls the revolting filthiness of execrable wickedness. As it does, he implies, the idolaters of India. The second difference between India and Tibet has to do with the nature of the deities. The Indian idolaters worship what they consider a supreme being, yet that deity is false, fictitious, unholy, monstrous. The Tibetans, on the other hand, do not acknowledge a supreme being. Instead, they offer obeisance only to figures who embody qualities that they deem honorable. Indeed, one might ask whether the Tibetans are idolaters at all. Desideri writes, they preferred not to recognize any supreme creator of the world with absolute and independent power over it and human beings, rather than assent to one in the way that was deceptively proposed to them. That being so, I say that according to their religion or sect, the Tibetans not only completely dismiss the existence of the true deity, but also do not recognize any false and monstrous divinity either, as many other idolatrous nations of Asia do. This difference between the Tibetans and other heathens raises a special challenge for the missionary. It was generally felt that heathens who worshipped a supreme deity offered an opportunity for conversion if that supreme deity could be deposed and supplanted by the one true God. From this perspective, the Hindus should be easier to convert than the Tibetans. The Tibetans, like all Buddhists, although this was unknown to Desideri, do not worship a supreme deity in the Christian sense of the term, and yet they were disposed to virtue. Desideri would develop his strategy for conversion accordingly. Before he left Tibet, he dispatched appeals to the Vatican imploring the Holy Father to allow him to continue his work there. While he awaited a response that never arrived, he continued writing what he considered his most important work, a refutation composed in excellent Tibetan of the central Buddhist doctrines of rebirth and emptiness. Desideri carried this manuscript with him back to Rome, where it languished in the Jesuit archives, read neither by the Tibetan audience for whom it was intended, nor by anyone else. The work is respectively entitled Inquiry into the Doctrines of Previous Lives and of Emptiness, offered to the scholars of Tibet by the white Lama called Ippolito. It's an extraordinary text in many ways. First, it is the most sophisticated work ever written in the Tibetan language by a European. Second, it reveals a deep and nuanced understanding of Tibetan Buddhist doctrine and philosophy, one that would not be matched by European scholarship until the late 20th century. His appreciation of Buddhism would remain unrivaled in Christian thought until Thomas Merton. Third, it contains the most beautiful and beautifully crafted Tibetan poetry composed by a Westerner. The work begins with a long poem in praise of the Heavenly Father, written with such sensitivity to Buddhist metaphor that it could easily be mistaken as a hymn to the Buddha. That is, Desideri's prayer to God looks like a prayer to the Buddha. One might even say that it apes Buddhist language and imagery. It's a long prayer, but let me quote just the opening passages here. And I know that there are some Tibetans in the audience, so let me begin by reading it in Tibetan. Hlakto mejing denda beda me, Jurki samgi milang sema zeta me, Setang doktang namgyur yeminga, Nyegun daktang ngowa nikidrel, sorry. Rangi shenla mader ramale, Jiye tamje kanla rakleba, Malu sheja jishin tamje ken, Tada datu rangi ranglanyam. Which means, there is nothing superior or higher than you, unrivaled and unequaled, inexpressible and conceivable, without measure or end, utterly without cessation, reversal or change, naturally free of defect and fault. Not relying or depending upon another yourself, all that exists depends on you. You know all that exists just as it is. For you, all is ever equal. Gently but firmly, you created all that is. Impartial to all, you are without bias. Unrivaled, you are the Lord of great compassion. After this prayer, Desideri continues in verse, explaining the motivations for his journey to what he calls Perdi, this Tibet. Because for Desideri, what we think of as of Tibet was at the time called Third Tibet, after Little Tibet, or Balistan, and Greater Tibet, or Ladakh. And he writes, the news that in this Tibet there are countless scholars, so versed in the various fields of knowledge, has spread in all directions, across great oceans and to different lands. As soon as this touched my ears, my mind was tormented by wonder. A great desire arose in me, uncontrollable and unstoppable, to see them with my own eyes, to gaze insatiably at these scholars of this Tibet. My mind became focused, free from doubt, and once decided, my intention remained as solid as a diamond, incapable of being destroyed by the 100,000 hardships and obstacles of the long voyage. So without laziness from the west, I crossed from one end of the ocean to the other, traveling through many lands until I reached Tibet, the essence of my journey. Desideri next tries to explain to his Tibetan audience why there is value in studying another religion. Although his motivations are somewhat different from scholars of later generations, he nonetheless provides an argument for what would eventually come to be called comparative religion, seeming to anticipate by a century and a half Friedrich Max Müller's famous dictum, "He who knows one religion knows none." And so he writes now in prose, "Regarding the religion of others, I can conclude without difficulty that seeing what is written and hearing what is explained will be sources of joy and delight to the minds of the learned in this Tibet. Yet to look at all the different religions of others, or at all of the essential points of a specific religion that one values with just the blink of an eye, is like not looking at all. Thus, abandoning the idea of looking at all the other religions, I will erect in the presence of the illuminated intellects of Tibetan scholars an object for their examination, the stainless, perfect, excellent, and supreme religion of the white people. I will explain it by elaborating from the perspective of the doctrines of previous lives and the emptiness of intrinsic existence on just two cherished articles of belief of that perfect and steadfast teaching. To encounter another tradition that accords greatly with one's own tradition and understand them both is like having two butter lamps burning in a single room, or one gold or silver ring shining with the light of two diamond studs. Again, if a tree receives the appropriate amount of water from separate sources, rainwater and water from a stream, its roots will grow large and the tree will be more and more firmly fixed in the earth. In the same way, by moistening one's mind with the complete instructions and essential points of one's own religion, as well as another religion that accords with it, one's body, speech, and mind will become most conducive to religion, and one will, like a thick nail, abide with a firm aspiration to religion. Next, he addresses an important question, and one that the Tibetans would obviously ask, which is, why study a religion that is false? And he explains, even if the other religion that one hears about and sees is not only inconsistent with one's own religion, but is a degraded view, sows misdeeds and is completely degenerate, yet doing so is a cause of benefit and joy to the mind of a learned person. For example, even though silver, iron, copper, wood, and clay are deficient and degenerate compared to gold, among these, some can be used as currency to purchase gold. Some as a tool and a means to discover gold. That is, you take some wood and some iron and you make a shovel and you dig up more gold. Some to cleanse all the stains and impurities of gold, and some can help mold the gold into whatever ornament one desires, such as earrings. By making the gold pliant and malleable, a craftsman can turn it into any ornament he desires. After explaining the purpose of his text, Desideri then sets out on a very detailed and, to this point in my translation, very tedious refutation of the doctrines of rebirth and emptiness, written in the traditional polemical style of Gakshak Bongsum. This is a three-part system in which one first refutes the position of the opponent, presents one's own position, and then dispels any objections over 464 very large pages. The work is unfinished, ending still in the very first part, refutation of the other's position, and just on the topic of rebirth. And so in the text that we have, he never arrives at the point of presenting his own position on the topic of rebirth, and never reaches the topic of emptiness at all. although his refutation of that doctrine appears unexpectedly in his Catechism on Christianity, written in Tibetan, which is called Essence of the Christian Religion. I'm translating these texts at the moment, so I have Desideri on the brain, and so I therefore must ask your forgiveness for droning on about him today. And so I should probably try to conclude today's lecture and this series of lectures with some final thoughts. I believe that we can forgive Desideri for condemning the Tibetans as idolaters when he writes in Italian, and for praising the Tibetans as renowned scholars when he writes in Tibetan. There's a long tradition in Buddhism of saying different things to different audiences, and Desideri had very specific motivations for his two voices in these two works. For those of us who are Tibetophiles, our hearts are warmed by his characterization of the Tibetans as more virtuous idolaters than those of India, although upon reflection, what he says does not make a great deal of sense. For the larger question of the European portrayal of the Buddha as an idol, Desideri is an important figure because he understood Tibetan Buddhist literature so well. As we've seen in earlier portrayals, knowledge of the Buddha comes from a garbled story told orally, perhaps mistranslated or misunderstood, from an Asian language into a European one. Or it comes from an account written at the request of the European, such as the story of Devadatta provided to the French in Siam. Even for those missionaries whom we esteem for their linguistic skills, such as Ricci, it was often the case that they did not read Buddhist texts in the original, but in the form of digests, often composed by a convert. And so we're not so surprised when the portrayals of the Buddha are so negative. But Desideri read all of Lamrim Chemo and translated it into Tibetan, a translation that was lost. He read large sections of the Tibetan canon, and he seems to have understood them. And still, the Tibetans were idolaters. The Buddha was an idol. His biography, the work of Satan. The goal of all the figures we've talked about over the past 3 days was conversion. And today, we don't particularly care for the idea of religious conversion, especially when it comes to Buddhism. We believe that Buddhists do not need to be converted because we like their religion. Indeed, it's such a good religion that it might not be a religion at all. And so we reject the descriptions of the Buddha as an idol as simply an error. But what became of Zaka and Samonakodom, of Buddhu and Pho? They are forgotten, only recalled as so many mistakes of a bygone age. We know better now. Unlike the intrepid travelers and missionaries to foreign climes, when we walk through the museum of a European capital or on a college campus and see the works of art on display there, a wooden Japanese statue from the Muromachi period, a Tibetan tanka painted at the time of the 7th Dalai Lama, a bronze image from the reign of King Rama IV of Thailand, a stone carving from Gandhara, we know that they all represent the same person. Our eyes have been properly trained to see through the bright colors of varnish of fantastic invention, as Desideri puts it, to see through the most striking differences in form, in color, in style, in accoutrements, to see a single figure, just as our minds have been trained to translate Hotoke and Sangye and Fo and Pu into a single word, Buddha. Yet, are they the same? Was something lost in the march of scholarly progress? Did something disappear when weathered stone turned to smooth flesh, when the idol turned into an image? Perhaps the collapse of many gods into a single human Buddha effaced a level of detail, of specificity, of locality that can no longer be discerned, yet was glimpsed so long ago by the eyes of those who could not read, but who could only see. Thank you.
Good afternoon. In this, his third essay, Don Lopez has given us yet another treat. This is the last of the series, and we wish there were more. In these 3 lectures, he has shown us not only what he's working on, what he currently has up his sleeve, so to speak, but also that he wears his tireless learning very well indeed. In this lecture, he took us briefly to Venice, the putative home of Marco Polo, Rome, the birthplace of his countryman Ippolito Desideri, the Tuscan town of Pistoia, and Lhasa. He has taken us to the Tibetan highlands, an area about which much has been written over the last 40 years, but which remains still little understood. He began his lecture about religious conflicts and why Buddhism, quote, has somewhat been deemed exempt from the perennial conflicts between religions is a question for another day. He has taken us on a tour of Athanasius Kircher's quite mistaken notions about Buddha and Buddhism. The 17th century German Jesuit priest was unfortunately unfamiliar with the so-called Evora fragments that were studied by Urs Ab in his very recent 2012 publication, The Cult of Emptiness. Ab's latest work concerns in part the literary remains of the 16th century Portuguese Jesuit Alessandro Valignano, Fanlian is his Chinese name, consisting of fragmentary Japanese texts that were no doubt inspired by Zen Buddhist notions and their Latin translation. Don Lopez also introduced us to the Italian Jesuit priest Ippolito Desideri and his remarkable Tibetan writings, some of which were only recently rendered into Italian by his fellow Jesuit Giuseppe Toscani. But Desideri is only remarkable for and of interest to us. The Tibetans seem to have taken absolutely no interest in him, and as far as I'm aware, he's not mentioned in one single Tibetan source. He might as well not have been there. Not insignificant in this context is that the first Tibetan translation of a portion of the Bible may have appeared as late as 1762, and in the course of the next centuries, the New Testament was translated several times. The Old Testament was until quite recently treated, but fragmentarily in Tibetan translation. This has now changed, and indeed, there are now several churches in the Kham region, Western Sichuan, with small congregations of evangelical Protestants. The encounter of different cultures does not always result in what is nowadays sometimes called a clash of civilizations. The encounter of different religious traditions also does not always result in a clash of religions, even if they often, even all too often, appear to do. Most often, however, it is not the religious convictions per se that are at the root of such clashes when they do take place. Rather, it is the competing political and economic interests or atavistic fears that cause certain groups of individuals to turn their backs at the most fundamental moral beliefs that they actually share and have in common. Religious dialogue and public disputation were not foreign to the Indian subcontinent. There were ample dialogues and public debates between Buddhists and non-Buddhists, Jains and Hindus of one or the other denomination and set of beliefs about points of doctrine. But to my knowledge, no one ever reached for the sword or bow to defend his religious turf. The Tibetans inherited the idea of monastic debates and did engage in debates over the centuries, but these were Buddhist internal ones. No Buddhist-Christian dialogues or debates are recorded for the early pre-modern periods. Desideri did not engage in such a public debate, and his writings in Tibetan never reached any Tibetan audience, let alone evoke a reaction. Only much later, in the second half of the 19th century, do we have a hint of a Buddhist Protestant-Christian dialogue that was written down, but more about this later. To be sure, empire, warfare, and trade, and the porous boundaries that characterized so much of the Himalayan range from Yunnan to Afghanistan had everything to do with the Tibetans' access to and acculturation of foreign products, including religion. Buddhism was introduced as a state religion during the heyday of the Tibetan Empire in the 8th century. The intellectual elite of the time may also have been somewhat familiar with Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism, and even with a form of Christianity, but these, again, had no impact whatsoever. By the end of the 11th century, the Tibetan area had become so suffused with Buddhism and its institutions that the Tibetans could not show any interest in different beliefs and religious practices. Once Tibetan culture had become by and large Buddhist in every respect, from the religious to the literary, in such domains of knowledge as astrology, astronomy, medicine, poetics, and even grammar, it became virtually unassailable for any other religious tradition. No single missionary of whatever stripe stood a chance in, as they now say, winning the Tibetans' hearts and minds. Until fairly recently, the Tibetan area was much like Christian medieval Europe, in that Buddhism was a culture monolith and a religious behemoth, unassailable. Let's now fast forward in time. It was primarily due to the Tibetan Buddhist missionary activities in the Xisha Empire in northwestern China during the late 12th and early 13th century, and owing to the fact that much of the Tibetan area had, from 1240 to 1368, become de facto and de jure part of the Great Mongol land, that the intellectual elites of Tibet came in contact with an assortment of Confucian officials, Taoist priests, Persian, Turkish, and Arab Muslims, Chinese and Uyghur Buddhists, and Christians of various denominations. Some Tibetan Lamas enjoyed such great renown that were able to draw students to Tibet from virtually every corner of nearby Asia. This marked the beginning of a new kind of Tibetan cosmopolitanism. Important religious hierarchs such as the Sakyapanita and the second Karmapa hierarch had contacts with Nestorian Christians, heaven worshippers, and Mongol shamans, among practitioners of other religions, as they were traveling through Inner Asia and China, but nothing really rubbed off, except perhaps the title of one of Karmapakshi's writings, which actually is a Mongol title, meaning eternal heaven, Mungche Tengri. Sakyapanita's nephew, Pakpa, was the first of one of several national preceptors who then rose to the unique position of imperial preceptor under Kublai. He and other Buddhists debated doctrinal issues with Taoists in the 1250s. Chiang Mai recorded and described in detail many of these encounters and debates in his Bianwei Lu, record of discussing falsehoods, compendium of 1291. But again, nothing was recorded in Tibet, nothing about it is recorded in Tibetan sources. In 1272, while writing an instructive piece for Prince Hoku, Pakpa enumerated the following non-Indic religious figures whose teachings he admonishes should not be regarded as being soteriologically efficacious, in that they, quote, do not liberate from samsara. These are Mashiach, Labgin, and Muhammad. The first clearly reflects the word Mashiach, Messiah, in Sanskrit, Masiha. The second, a Taoist patriarch, and the third, Muhammad, and this is all he has to say about them. Born in the Dolpo area of northern Nepal in 1507, Jonan Kungal Drojak has noted on several occasions in his autobiographical sketches that he met and even conversed with a group of yogis of various denominations in what is now Muktinath, Nepal. Yogis whose main teacher had been Goraknath, that is a Shaivite teacher, as well as with a Nawari Pandit by the name of Mahabodhi from the Kathmandu Valley. What is a bit unusual is that he comments on the similarity of the practice of other religions with his own Buddhism, stating that the Indian yogis are the Gorak, that is Goraknath, these are the Shaiva Kamphata yogis. The Mongol, Kodas, I'm not sure what that means. The Brahmins, Ram. And the Tibetans repeat the formula, Om Mani Padme Hum. With surprising generosity of spirit, he states these are essentially the same thing. Tibetan contacts with other peoples and their beliefs markedly intensified during the 17th and 18th centuries. Two factors played a major role in this upswing. One was no doubt the unification of much of the Tibetan culture area under Ganden Podang government in Lhasa, which the fifth Dalai Lama established first in his home monastery of Drepung in 1643 and then in the Potla Palace. The other was the Qing Manchu dynasty. During the late 17th, 18th, and much of the 19th century, its capital city, Beijing, was one of the great cosmopolitan centers of the world, no doubt in part owing to the fact that Qing China at that time was the world's largest economy. Indian, Sikkimese, Nepalese, Bhutanese, Mongol, and Manchu secular and religious dignitaries, scholars, traders, and adventurers visited or had more indirect contacts with the courts of the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Dalai Lamas. At the same time, numerous Tibetans were traveling to Nepal, as well as to China, and as well as to Russia. And several members of the Tibetan religious and social elites have left us interesting records of their travels and the experiences they had along the way in their diaries and autobiographies. Beginning with the Portuguese Jesuit priests Andrade and Marques in the 1620s, various parts of the Tibetan area were visited by a number of Catholic priests who belonged to several different orders, priests who were ostensibly in search of souls that, in their view, needed to be saved. One undoubted high point among these contacts is the well-documented stay in central Tibet of Desideri during the years 1715 to roughly 21. The earliest Christian missionaries with whom the Tibetans came in contact were, to a man, Catholic priests, who were later followed by Russian Orthodox priests. It is only during the 18th century that Tibetans began to take notice of Russia, Urusu, or Gyaltser, and this was largely due to the contacts they had made with Russians, and probably also those affiliated with the Russian ecclesiastical mission in Beijing. Another high point of this era, as well as being an almost natural function of the evangelical impulse of Catholic Christianity and the cosmopolitanism of the Qing Empire, was that Tibetans and Mongols were able to gain access to a collection of writings of Western astronomy that was to have at least a lasting effect on one tradition of Tibetan culture, namely calendar making. A band of Jesuit priest astronomers and their Chinese acolytes introduced Western astronomy into China during the late Ming and the early Qing. The Tibetans became aware of these contributions through their fellow Mongol religionists, as well as by direct contact with the Gangxi court of Qing China. Traditional Tibetan culture makes no distinction between astrology or astronomy. In Europe, a distinction between the two first was made as late as the Renaissance. But even so, bona fide or European astronomers such as Kepler continued to take not merely an interest in, but also continued to write on astrological subjects. In this connection, mention is to be made of a Chinese translation of a collection of tracts on Western astronomy, that is the Xifang Xianfa Li Shu. That is a tract on astronomy and calendar science according to the new Western methods. It consists of Chinese translation and reformulation of a series of texts on astronomy that were written in part by such Jesuit scholar priests as Charles von Bell, that's a curious name, and Verbiest, kind of means the sound of the bell, huh? And Verbiest. The Chinese text was translated into Mongol in 1711 by order of the Gangxi Emperor himself. Simply titled Gyatzi Tianmo, that is the Great Chinese Astronomy, the Tibetan translation of this compendium may date from 1714 and 1715. The bilingual pagination with the Tibetan numbering on the left and the Chinese on the right-hand side of the page of the block print seems to have its origin in the fact that Chinese, not Tibetan artisans, were responsible for carving the printing blocks. Indeed, being ignorant of Tibetan, carving Chinese-style pagination was the only way in which Chinese carvers could keep track of what they were carving. In other words, this particular work was carved in Beijing. The Jesuit priest in China were men of science. Desideri was trained in humanities and was, even if the Tibetans had an interest to learn more about what he knew or where he came from, perhaps unable to introduce them to the fundamentals of Western sciences. His stay was also short-lived, and perhaps it is more fair to say that he simply had not been given a chance. He was recalled, as Don Lopez told us. But what was perhaps the overriding fact is that the Tibetan astrosciences had been Buddha-given, and thus could not be improved upon, not even by a Jesuit priest. Finally, now we fast forward to 1889 to 1890. It is from the year 1890 that we have what appears to be the earliest Tibetan documentary evidence of a Tibetan encounter with Christianity, not of the Catholic or Russian Orthodox, but of the evangelical Protestant variety. This little text that bears witness to this is titled Record of a Dispute, a lion's roar that subdues a crazed elephant-like opponent. It is a tsuyik, a genre of Tibetan literature that comes close to the medieval Quaestio Disputata. It is a record of a debate that took place from January 13 to 15th, 1890, between a Tibetan scholar by the name of Mayung Panita and the Lama Lame Ferengi, that is a foreign Lama, the English Cecil Polhill, who was one of the so-called Cambridge Seven. Polhill, or Polhill Turner, affiliated himself with the China Inland Mission in 1885, and thus began a career of missionary work, ending in a return to England in 1900. This was followed briefly by a Pentecostal baptism in the US in the early 1908, which then led him to found the Pentecostal Missionary Union for Great Britain and Ireland in 1909 with the aid of a personal fortune. There are many things of interest in this little text, not least of which is that Jesus Christ is styled Sangye Yesu, that is Buddha Jesus, and that the Tibetan Lama states in the afterword that he found the missionary naive, unschooled, and unlogical. Unlike the vast majority of his Catholic counterparts, there's every chance that as a theologian, and as was the case with most Protestant evangelical missionaries of the time, Paul ran a none too uncertain deficit. At the outset of the first and third lectures, Don Lopez reminded us ever so briefly of a remark made by Marco Polo, a native of possibly the city of Venice, about Sri Lanka and the Buddha as he was en sea route to his native Italy. Desideri, much like his countrymen, also left no visible mark in either Tibetan or Chinese or in any of the literatures of the peoples with which they both had come into contact. This is quite noteworthy and perhaps even sobering. Maybe when Desideri becomes more of a household word, we will hear children at play exclaim, Desi, Deri, Desi, Deri. For now, with the coming of summer, we'll have to be content with Marco Polo, Marco Polo. As a culture historian, as an intercultural interlocutor par excellence, one who intrepidly negotiates the often treacherous paths that connect two or more cultures, Don Lopez has few peers in the Buddhist world of scholarship. He's what in Tibetan is called a lotsa, a translator. In Sanskrit, perhaps lokachakshu or lokakshu, or most probably a approximate vernacular a variation or vernacular thereof. It is a term that we encounter in the two 8th century esoteric Indian Buddhist works. Meaning eye of the world and a common metaphor for the sun, he has provided us in these 3 lectures with a new set of ideas, a new set of eyes, by means of which the horizon of our world has expanded. Thank you very much. And I thank you.